A few things about me. I love me some donuts. How many of you guys love you some donuts? See, I like Krispy Kreme. I like Dunkin' Donuts. How many of you, show of hands, are Team Krispy Kreme? Team Krispy Kreme? Okay, how about this? How many of you are Team Dunkin' Donuts? You prefer Dunkin' Donuts. All right. So I'm actually on a completely different team. I have this this obsession over this donut shop in Carolina Beach. It's a place where the angels sing. It's holy ground. You actually have to take your shoes off whenever you show up. It's this place that I'm pretty sure if you eat one of the donuts, you'll get saved, probably. The place, of course, I'm talking about is Britt's Donuts. If you've never had it, it'll change your life. I promise you, if you ever get me Britt's Donuts, I will be friends with you forever. I will love you forever. Another thing about me, I am married to Lorena. How many of you guys know who that is? She sings on the worship team sometimes. I met her on a mission trip, and there she is, standing beside me. You can't say I'm sorry, you need glasses. So I met Lorena on a mission trip to Nicaragua, and I remember that experience fondly. I remember meeting her for the first time and seeing her as this sassy, sarcastic Latina. And I remember thinking, wow, I like her. And I remember thinking, man, I'm going to marry this girl. After knowing her for 2 days, which is something you don't generally tell people, because then they might start to look at you as one of those weird stalker people. So what did I do? I told everyone that I was going to marry this girl. And many of my friends, they were concerned, understandably, right? In fact, many of them actually told me point blank, Stephen, this is not going to work. They told me that. But guess what? Hello, we're married. We got married in October of 2016, and our marriage has gotten better over time. And recently, we've actually had our first child. If you want to go ahead and put that picture on the screen. You may have noticed me recently holding a baby in the lobby. Her name is Harper. In this picture, she's about 2 months old at the time. And I'm pretty confident that she is the cutest baby on the planet. So, in fact, I'm not even sure at 2 months how she's able to move her eyebrows like that, but, you know, she's my child, so. So I just told you guys some interesting or maybe uninteresting information about me, some things about me, but I told y'all this to make a point. I told y'all this to make a point. You may know some things about me, but many of you probably don't really know me. In fact, many of you do not know me personally. So this is why. When you know someone, you know what their strengths are. You know what their weaknesses are. When you know someone, you know what makes them laugh. You know what makes them upset. In fact, you know what their character is like. When you know someone, you know what their struggles are, do you not? If you really know someone. See, there's a difference between knowing something about a person and actually knowing that person personally. Do you guys understand? Does that make sense? My question for you tonight is this: do you know information about Jesus, or do you know him personally? Because there's a difference. Today we're going to be in Mark chapter 1, starting at verse 16. So preferably, if you guys have your Bibles with you, I'd like for you to follow along. The scriptures will be on the screen, but we are going to be looking at the passages themselves, and we're going to be going back and forth between places and dissecting what's happening. So before we start reading, just know that in the context of this story, Just know that Jesus has started his ministry on earth, and he's about to get down to business. Are y'all ready? All right, let's go. Mark chapter 1, starting at verse 16. It says, "Passing along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.' And immediately they left their nets and followed him." So how many of you fished before? Has everyone fished before? At least seen someone fish? We normally fish with fishing poles, right? Whenever we try to catch fish, that's normally the routine that we have. So Simon and Andrew, the people in this text, they didn't do that. They would actually use these gigantic nets that had weights on them. And whenever they would see a school of fish, they would throw those nets in hope of catching as many fish as possible. And that net would sink all the way to the bottom. And then one of them would actually have to jump in the water, swim all the way to the bottom, and they would have to grab the rope that was attached to the netting. And so what they did then is they didn't get back in the boat. They actually had to swim to the shore in order to get all of the fish that they had just caught. So fun thing about the fish in this scenario, fish was actually the primary meat that was consumed in this culture. How many of you guys love steak? How many of you guys love chicken? I love me some of those things. Unfortunately, there was none of that, or if there was very limited amount. There was no chicken nuggets. I'm sorry, you couldn't pull up to the local Chick-fil-A and get some chicken minis. Wasn't a thing. So fishing might have been fun for many of us if you all have taken part of fishing before, but for Simon and Andrew, fishing was their business. It was how they lived to support themselves. So Jesus says, though, in verse 17, if you look at this, he says, "To follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." At first glance, whenever I've read this before, it always sounded weird to me. Does it not? Like this is a weird statement. But what Jesus was saying here is to tell them to drop everything that you're doing, to join me, because I want to train you to preach the gospel, which is the good news. And so that Jesus wanted them to be able to be a part of something that was bigger than themselves. So watch what happens next in verse 18. They left their nets and they followed him. So one of my side jobs that I do for a living, I do landscaping, and that part of that is I cut grass, and I use these big machines, these zero-turn mowers, to get the job done. And it costs a lot of money to get one of these. Now, I'm not sure what I would do if someone came to me and said, "Hey, come with me." I'm not sure if I would want to just leave all of that behind me, because what could happen? It could get lost, it could get rained on, someone could steal it, right? But what did these guys do in the story? They leave the very tools that help them live. So let's keep reading on, verse 19. "And going on a little farther, he, being Jesus, saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in their boat mending the nets. And immediately he called them. And they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him." So now these men, they didn't just leave their stuff. They left their father too. So imagine if you told your father he's got this family business, and you walk up to him and you're like, "Hey, Dad, I know you got this enterprise going on, but I'm not going to be a part of it anymore. See ya." Would that be a good conversation? It'd probably be a little bit awkward. But part of life. So why did these men leave everything to follow Jesus? Here's why. Rabbis, which were also known as teachers, of that day, they were well-respected men. And if someone wanted to learn from this rabbi or teacher, they would have to seek them out and they would have to ask them to be their student. In fact, beg them to be their student. These teachers didn't just pick anyone, though. They would actually select them. They would be very selective. And when the men were actually chosen by these teachers, it would be like this huge honor. And so Jesus, as you notice in this passage, he doesn't do that. In fact, what does he do? He goes to them. Jesus sought these men out. These men knew following Jesus was more important than anything else, which is why they dropped everything to follow him. So we got a lot more to read, but we're going to keep going. Starting in verse 21, and guys, it's about to get real. I love this portion. So here we go. Starting in verse 21. And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and he was teaching. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know you, who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him, and they were all amazed, so that they had questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. So I just read a lot. There was a lot that happened in that text. So before we get into the meat of what just happened, I want to mention some terms here so we know what certain things mean. Verse 21, it mentions synagogues. What are synagogues? There were these places where people would come together to meet. In our terminology, it's like if everyone came to the local church, right? And these synagogues were where the scriptures were read, and it wasn't uncommon for there to be a guest teacher, which is why Jesus was just able to show up and do his thing. And in verse 22, we see that Jesus taught differently than the other teachers and scribes, because these scribes would simply read the texts, and they would quote other scribes. Jesus didn't quote anyone. And he spoke with authority. He spoke differently, that they were not prepared, because he had authority. He had power in his words, something that had weight to it. Because what he was speaking was pure truth. And the people were amazed because they've never heard anything like this. Notice how only after Jesus starts speaking, this man who is demon-possessed begins to cry out and to make a scene. How many of you, just show of hands, how many of you guys like scary movies? See, I can't be like that. Every time I've seen a scary movie, it freaks me out. In fact, I remember a while back when I was watching a scary movie with some friends, I was that type of person where I would just be talking audibly while the movie was happening just to try and calm myself, aggravating everyone around me. But So I remember seeing this movie back in the day called Paranormal Activity. Have you guys ever heard of that movie? It's about a decade old at this point. I saw this movie and it freaked me out. It was the kind of movie where you can't sleep for days. You're always looking around, looking over your shoulder. And this movie followed this couple where they begin to notice that there's something wrong, that their house might have been haunted. And so they actually decided to film everything they did, hoping that they might catch something on camera. So over time, though, things got worse. And I believe the demon, if I remember correctly, actually killed one or both of the main characters in the movie. And as I was leaving the movie theater with a friend of mine, I remember him saying, man, I'm so glad none of that was real. And then I turned to him and I said, dude, that movie wasn't real, but demons are very much here on this earth. So some of you may not know what to believe. Some of you may not believe that demons exist. But in fact, I've actually had two of my family members, they've actually have had encounters with them throughout their life. And so I'm going to leave their names out for privacy reasons, but I want to tell you just briefly without getting too much into detail, because the more you get into detail, the scarier it gets, right? So I want to give you just a glimpse of what my family has been through. One family member of mine, they were actually staying with some friends at the time, and they were there, and they were in bed. It was around 3 a.m. They had the covers over their head, and at 3 a.m. they hear the door open, and these footsteps coming to the bed, and this family member was actually trying to make sure they didn't move at all because they weren't even sure who it was. They thought it was just someone who lived there just coming to check on them. And the bed on one side actually sunk in as if someone was sitting on the side. And then they felt pressure on their back as if a hand was touching the back of their back. And after a little bit of time, the pressure disappeared. The pressure on the side of the bed was removed. And this family member finally had the courage to look up and to see if anyone was there, and no one was there. The door was closed, and they had the courage enough to go back to sleep. The next morning, they woke up and they asked the family members, hey, did you come and check up on me last night? So the problem, before I tell you, the problem with this scenario was there was only one door into the room, and it was locked. And so when this family member asked them, hey, did you come into the room last night? They were like, no, why would we do that at 3 a.m.? The other situation, and this one I'm going to be very brief, there was another family member of mine who they would used to stay in a portion of their house. It was like the bonus room, so to speak, in that house. And they actually stayed there a few times, and during the middle of the night, they would wake up and they would actually saw these dark outlines. And so they actually saw the faces of these beings in their room. And this didn't happen just once. It didn't happen twice. But it happened 3 times. So these stories that we're discussing, y'all, this is real stuff. This is real events. So, but I want you guys to know something. Please do not think that these interactions were fun or enjoyable or pleasant experiences whatsoever. They were not. Satan is a deceiver. We may not be seeing things as often as these stories that I mentioned in real life. However, he works in subtle ways. Think about this. When there's division in the church, Satan is at work. When he makes you believe things about yourself that are not true, Satan is at work. and he'll make you think it's everything else other than him. So in this passage, what Jesus is dealing with here, this is real. So we're going to see soon how this relates to us. But before we do that, let's look back at the text. So look at what this demon-possessed man says in verse 24. He says, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." First of all, the man says, us. What does that mean? He wasn't possessed by one. There's multiple demons here who's in this man. The other thing to notice is this. Look at verse 27. The people were amazed, but these demons, they were terrified. The people were in wonder, while the demons were panicking, blending in the synagogues, the churches. But when they saw the face of Jesus, they knew they couldn't hide anymore because he was staring them down. The demons had a reason to be afraid. And all Jesus had to do to remove them is speak. That's the power our God has. And I'll ask this question that I asked at the beginning. Do you know information about Jesus, or do you know him? If you know info about Jesus, you may fear the things I just told you stories about. But if you know him, then you would know that there's nothing to fear because he is bigger, he is stronger, and he is greater than any demon or any obstacle or anything we will face in this life. So we're going to skip the next few verses, 29 through 39, just because we want to make sure y'all aren't here for the rest of the night. So we're going to jump to verse 40, and this will be the last passage we read this evening. So Jesus cleanses the leper. Verse 40, and a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, him being Jesus, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean, and Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once. And he said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them." But he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. So at this point, Jesus is becoming quite famous. In fact, in one of the verses we skipped earlier in verse 33, it mentions how the entire town came to the place that Jesus was staying at. Imagine if the entire town of Benson came to your house. Like, not only would you not have enough room in your house, you wouldn't have enough room in your yard with everyone standing. This is what this looked like. But I wanted to end here in this passage tonight because this story really gets to the heart of who Jesus is. So this passage in verse 40, it mentions a leper. What is that? What is a leper? A leper is referring to a person who had this disease called leprosy. So leprosy was this skin disease that seemed to have been very contagious, and it would actually destroy a person's body over time. In fact, from what I've researched, it seems like It was a disease that removed your ability to feel pain. Now, in a way, at first thought, you might think, well, that sounds pretty cool. That'd actually be pretty nice. The problem is, if you don't have pain, then that means you have no warning signs when your body is being destroyed by something. So the problem with leprosy is that you would do so much damage to your body over time that most people who got leprosy, from that point on, they wouldn't live past 30 years because they were unable to limit the injuries they were incurring, nor would they be able to fight off the sicknesses and infection. And not only that, you would actually have tumors growing, like massive boils, growing all over your skin. If you had leprosy, I want you to get this. No one wanted to be around you. You would be considered an outcast. Do y'all remember what happened roughly 2 years ago when this pandemic hit? It was around like the first 2 or 3 weeks when no one knew what in the heck was even going on. And I know people over time caught the disease, but I remember one of the most difficult parts of that season was being separated from everyone I cared about. And maybe you guys can relate to that. The thing is, it only lasted a few months, right? Roughly. But imagine if this was the case for your entire life. For these lepers, that's how life was for them. These lepers were not allowed to take part of any religious or social activities. So in other words, couldn't come here. They couldn't touch other people. They couldn't even get close. In fact, people were so afraid of catching leprosy. Think about this. The people who didn't have leprosy would pick up rocks to throw them at the people who had it in fear that they might catch it. Lepers were treated so terribly and they became so deformed over time, they must have felt like they were no longer human. Imagine if you were one of these lepers. Imagine if you were in their position. How would you feel? How would you cope knowing that no one would never touch you again? That no one would ever hug you again? That you couldn't even get a handshake? Now look at these verses again, going back to verse 40. And a leper came to him, imploring him to Jesus, begging Jesus, and kneeling and said to him, if you will, if you desire, you can make me clean. Moved with pity, some versions say moved with compassion, he, being Jesus, stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I will, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. Did you see what Jesus did here? Jesus cared enough about this person to stretch out his hand and touch him. And that was probably the first human interaction he's had in possibly his entire life. Did Jesus have to touch this man to heal him? So why did he do it? Jesus knew, though, that this man didn't just need healing, he needed to be loved. Do you know information about Jesus, or do you know him? If you know Jesus, you would have to put effort into knowing him, right? One problem I'm seeing, and this is a slight tangent, but one thing I'm seeing is that people listen to sermons, one like this one, to attempt to get closer to God. The problem is that doesn't work. The reason I was even able to speak to you about all this material tonight is because I had to have one-on-one time with Jesus in order to even know what I was going to say. If you are listening to sermons to fill you up, and I'm talking about things you listen here in this building or maybe YouTube or podcast, whatever it is, if you are listening to sermons to fill you up, you are not getting to know Jesus personally. You are learning info about him. Do you know how to get to know someone? It's very obvious. You spend time with them, right? When I was dating Lorena, we used this very ancient technology called Skype. I feel old. We used it to communicate with each other because at that time she lived in a different country. And so we didn't have a choice. We couldn't see each other in person. And so in order to figure out if we were a good fit for each other, we had to spend time with each other. Relationships take two people, though. We know this. Lorena had to pursue me just as much as I had to pursue her. But guess what? Jesus has never stopped pursuing you. In fact, I believe he's pursuing some of you right now. What would this world look like if all of us individually began to pursue Jesus? What would our friends, your schools, your work, your family, what would it look like? What would change? For starters, you'd have peace in your life. Life is still going to be hard, and there are going to be times where you're probably not going to be happy. But that peace that you've been desperately looking for would be found. You'd also have clarity. There's a lot of voices in this world, and it's very difficult sometimes to know who to listen to. And so unless you're listening to the main source of truth, you're never going to be able to discern everything out there, what is true and what is not. What would happen? Your families, even though many of them are broken, could begin to be renewed and restored. And what would happen? You personally, you would know that you are loved by God, the God who created you, and that he wants so much more for you in your life. So I'm going to close with this. We've been talking about what this gospel, what does the gospel mean? It literally means good news. So I'll close with this. Jesus, as you guys know, he was fully God and fully man. He came down to this earth 2,000 years ago roughly, and he died on a cross for our sins. He died because there had to be a penalty for the sins that we've done. Have you ever told a lie before? Have you ever stolen anything? Have you ever looked at someone in a way you know you probably shouldn't have looked at them? Like in a way where your mom will probably smack you in the face if she found out you were looking at them that way? That's just 3 of the 10 commandments. Do you guys think if you stood before a holy God, if you would be innocent or guilty? If no one intervened, you would be guilty. Because of what he did, dying on the cross, raising again 3 days later, he not only showed that he is God, but that our relationship with him can be restored. I want you guys to go ahead.